Okay, so I'm going to do a little test and see how well you know me. Okay? So it's true and false. True or false, all right? True or false? I once stole a car. Yeah, you have to do it. You have to be free to speak. Okay? True or false? I once stole a car. True. Okay, true or false? I know how to ski. True. I have been here almost 8 years. True or false? I know how to play the guitar. True. Wow. You don't know me very well. Wow. Well, it happened when I decided that I wanted to be a global mission volunteer. I filled out my paperwork and sent it into our church-wide offices, and I let them match me up for wherever they thought my skills would be best. Now, in the back of my mind, I figured, since my parents were missionaries and I was born in Ethiopia, and the first 4 years of my life I had that Ethiopian language back there somewhere, that they'd probably assign me to Ethiopia, and I'd go and work there for the 5 years that I was signing up for. Nope, didn't happen. So then I thought, okay, let's see. I studied Spanish for 2 years in high school and for 1 year in college. Not very good at it, but I did study Spanish, so I'll probably end up in some Spanish-speaking country. Didn't happen. No, instead they saw, oh, true or false, I have an Old Testament religion major. True. True. Mom, you can't answer that. It's not right. Yes, I have an Old Testament religion major. So they needed a teacher, a high school and middle school teacher in a school in Slovakia, a Lutheran high school that was 450 years old. It had been opened and closed many different times. Most recently, it had been closed during the years of communism, but they were back open, and they needed someone to help teach religion. They had a pastor there. I wasn't a pastor yet, but they had a pastor there that was in his late 70s, and those kids were running over him. You see, when they started this school, the government didn't allow them to restrict that only Lutherans could go to that school. Instead, they had to do two things. Take a test to know a good understanding of the Slovak language, and then to know the English language, at least a little bit, to have had an introduction to English. Well, here's the thing. The only people in 1991, right after the fall of communism, that knew English were the kids of communists. So it was a very interesting experience. The other thing that doomed that poor 78-year-old pastor was that it wasn't a graded class. So literally, kids would sit there reading their newspapers while I was trying to teach religion. So I get sent to Slovakia. And I show up with my guitar. I felt a little bit like Maria in The Sound of Music, I wouldn't let them put the guitar under, I didn't trust the baggage carrier, so I'm hand carrying my guitar. So I got my guitar in its case, and I come walking into the school, and the very first day, I started class with music. And I taught them the song, "We are marching in the light of God. We are marching in the light of God." We sang that at first service, and it fit really well. We are marching in the light of God. You know it, right? It just kind of gets in you. Well, not those kids. That's pretty fluffy music. There's not any meat in that about real strong understanding of who Jesus is and what the resurrection means. That came from the Slovak pastor that was working with us. His explanation of why the kids weren't singing with me. Never fear, I kept going in every day and trying to start out with some music. Now, I don't play the guitar like these guys do. I'm just a camp player. I wish you guys could have seen all the campers singing on that camp song that we just sang, Waves of Mercy. So I just play chords, but I do my best. And we had chapel once a week, and I would play my guitar. And we'd sing those songs, and a few kids would sing. Unless the principals turned around and said, "Sing!" Then they all sang. We are, in this season after Easter, looking at people that encountered Jesus in one way or another, and that in their encounter they were changed, so that the resurrection truly would change their lives, give them direction, so that they lived free and fearless, so that they lived resurrected lives. Easter really is the big holiday of the church. But if you're like me, the Easter eggs have long been put away. All that candy grass that people kept giving me, I've eaten. A couple of the chocolate eggs are left, but most of it's gone. And those baby chicks, let's not even talk about what might have happened to those baby chicks. They're gone. Easter seems to have been packed away. And the resurrection seems like just another thing that happened a long time ago. Paul, that we read about in the second lesson today, had an encounter on the Damascus Road where he encountered Jesus in a most unlikely form. It was a mystical experience that Paul tried many times to explain. And you can read about those explanations in many different places in our New Testament. But Paul believed and lived, believing in the presence of a resurrected Christ. Not somebody that he'd heard about and read about and studied about a long time ago, but with conviction, Paul believed that Christ was alive and well. In fact, he wrote in 1 Corinthians, "And if Christ has not been raised, then empty is our preaching, empty too your faith." The New Testament is almost all, other than the Gospels, almost all either written by Paul, attributed to Paul, or about Paul. Paul is one of those people that we lift up as a hero of the faith, someone who came and helped to form the church and make the church what it is today. In the midst of his ministry and his life as a new believer in Jesus, Paul suddenly had that confidence that he was to go out into the Macedonian lands, and even Paul finally ended up in Rome. I always think to myself that Paul believed he could convert Caesar. He was wanting to see Caesar and tell him how much God loved him and how much Jesus had done for him. In fact, last year, during one of the encyclical writings that, 2 years ago, I believe, Pope Benedict put out, he wrote, "The resurrection is a fundamental fact, almost a previous basic assumption, in base of which Paul can formulate his synthetic proclamation. He who has been crucified and who has thus manifested the immense love of God for man has risen and is among us." I think that the two things that we can lift up about Paul to understand his belief and power of the resurrection is, first of all, his willingness to go, to march out wherever he felt called to go. And second, his telling, his being willing to preach and talk about God's love. Now, if you've read the New Testament, you know that he was quite a preacher. In fact, he preached so long one time that a kid fell asleep and fell out the window, hit his head, and died. But if you keep reading, Paul goes and revives him. Paul, a hero of the faith. In our Godly Play stories, I know that children are studying now some of the heroes of the faith, the saints that we know, people that we can see and grab a hold of as concrete witnesses to how to live resurrected lives in our world today. St. Augustine says, Christians are not spared suffering. On the contrary, they get a little extra. Because to live the faith expressed the courage to face life and history more deeply. And with everything, only in this way, experiencing suffering, we experience life in its depth, in its beauty, and in the great hope elicited by Christ, crucified and risen. The believer finds himself between two poles. On one side, the resurrection, which in some ways is already present and operative in us. And on the other, the urgency of fitting oneself into this process that leads everyone and everything to plenitude, as described in the letter to the Romans with audacious imagination. Remember, Paul wrote that. As all of creation groans and suffers near labor pains, in this way we too groan in hope of the redemption of our body, of our redemption and resurrection. Paul helps us to understand theologically how powerful the resurrection is for those who are living, those of us who are here, still remembering Easter. So when I got to Slovakia, the first thing I did was really try to learn the language. I took language lessons that gave me a horrible headache every day. But the one thing that I think worked the best for me is I had this big book of Slovak language. It didn't say Slovak language for dummies, but it might as well have been. And I would go into the little cafes, and I would sit down, I'd order a cup of coffee, and I'd sit there all by myself at a table with that big book. And before long, a little old lady or a little old man or one or two would come and sit down with me. You see, in Slovakia, you never sit alone. Someone would always join you if you sat alone at a table. And they'd point on that book and they'd say, Rozumiesz? Which I learned pretty quickly means, do you understand that? And I would say, no. And for the next half hour or 45 minutes, they would practice with me. That's how I learned the language. And because I really learned the language well enough to argue with the janitor and win, they decided that I would be a safe bet to go and be with the kids every year for 2 weeks when they went to ski school. So they'd go to ski school and they wanted them still to learn a little bit of English, and they wanted somebody who would be on the slopes to understand a little bit of what was going on. Now the slopes in Slovakia are not groomed. There are not green, blue, and black mountains. And there's not even always a nice way to get to the top of the mountain. But I loved going and skiing with those kids. And I did fall a lot. I didn't say I was a really good skier, but I said I was a skier. And I did ski with those kids. But one time I can remember stopping, and I was taking a picture of the beautiful landscape. And I heard this chorus of crazy singing. And what I heard was, we are skiing in the light of God. We are skiing in the light of God. Amen.